This is a lecture for History 226 on the topic of pre-Islamic Arabia on the eve of the rise of Islam and Muhammad. I must preface these remarks by saying that it is difficult to get a real fix on what the period before the rise of Islam was like. The problem is the sources that we have to rely on. Muslims refer to this time before the rise of Islam as the Jahiliyyah age, the era of barbaric ignorance, and the way in which it has been depicted by Muslims is that it's a terribly benighted time, a time when life of human beings was bad, and everything became better once the message of Islam was delivered to Muhammad and he delivered it to the people around him. A problem here is that our sources in getting at the pre-Islamic age are pretty poor. We do not have much in the way of written sources before the Islamic age. We have a few inscriptions in caves and that sort of thing, but that's about it, other than things that people who are not from Arabia wrote about it. So it's really tough. And let me just pick out one topic to give a sense of how difficult it is. The question of the status of women is one on which there's been a fair amount of writing. That is, the status of women prior to the rise of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula has attracted a fair amount of attention. But authors disagree, and there will never be a way to get them all on the same page because of the nature of our sources. Muslim writers tend to argue that Muhammad greatly improved the situation of women. There are many Western scholars who argue that, in fact, the situation of women in the Arabian Peninsula was, in many ways, fairly high. They had a strong positioning that only declined a couple of centuries into the spread of Islam. So it is very difficult to get our hands on very reliable evidence about this pre-Islamic age. Despite that fact, I'm going to try to say a few things about society in pre-Islamic times in Arabia. I will do what many people have done and break society down into three groups. Although this lecture is not divided according to these three groups, I don't have a section on each of the three that is cohesive and tight, but I will occasionally talk about these groups. The first of these groups is the farmers. And I'm not going to have a whole lot to say about these folks. Farming was mainly the growing of date palms and a few cereal grains in oases in various places in the Arabian Peninsula, except down in the southwestern part of the Arabian Peninsula. There was enough agriculture that one could argue that it wasn't just oases where it took place, but that was something that did happen in the Arabian Peninsula, but it wasn't a gigantic percentage of the population that were involved in this. Another group, by the way, here's what an oasis would look like from the desert. You have the green area of the oasis and the desert beyond the oasis. This particular picture is from Morocco rather than the Arabian Peninsula. But it's not completely unlike what we would find in the Arabian Peninsula. A second grouping that I will have something to say about is the nomads. And I'll bypass them for the moment and mention another grouping that I will talk about, and that is the merchants. And again, I won't have a great deal to say about them, but I will have something to say about them. So let me get back to the nomads. Nomads were people who were always on the move. The term in English that is borrowed from Arabic for them is Bedouin. It's Bedouin in the English language spelling. These people were herders of animals, goats and sheep, and also camels. Their life involved raiding, that is, raiding communities around them to get the things that they needed, but also trading with communities around them to get what they needed. For example, they did use agricultural products. They didn't necessarily grow them, though. They got their hands on them by either buying them or ripping them off. Or in some cases, nomads did some trading on the side. Sort of the core economic aspect of their life, however, is herding animals. And they lived in tents, and they moved around to bring their animals to places where there was fodder, where there were plants that they could eat, and where there was water. And that changed season by season. The life of nomads was a kind of highly specialized style of life. You could argue that in some sense, in the age in which we're talking, it was a kind of high-tech lifestyle. There's a certain kind of technology involved with raising and living off camels. And it's hard to think of it as technology, but it was a kind of technology. These people also lived by gathering protection money from communities around them, towns of farmers and merchants who would basically pay the nomads both to leave them alone and to protect them from other raiding nomads. This business of raiding, let me go ahead to a word here on the slide. This term, ghazw, and sometimes you'll see it spelled this way, means raiding. And this was a part of the lifestyle of Bedouins, of nomads. One of the things I would like to talk about for just a moment is the so-called camel revolution. The camel provided a means for a much more robust life in arid areas than had been possible before the camel. And one of the questions that has arisen is, when did camel nomadism first pop up? Many books say that camel domestication came about between around 1200 and 1000 BC. But a book by a guy named Richard Bulliet, entitled The Camel and the Wheel, disagrees on this issue. This is one of the issues that he focuses on in this book, and He argues that some kinds of camel domestication came about long before these dates on this slide. He says that long before 1000 BC, camels were domesticated for the purposes of using them as dairy animals to get milk from them. He also argues that as early as about 2000 BC, the incense trade, the trade in frankincense and myrrh, used camels, though he says that camel nomadism had not yet arisen in this period. For the most part, these camels were led and the goods were put on their backs, and camel nomadism as a lifestyle had not yet arisen because that entails, among other things, the warlike activities of camel nomads. I talked about raiding, and that doesn't really happen yet, according to Bulliet. Bulliet argues that camel nomadism did not come about until the camel became useful in battle, and that came with the development of the northern Arabian saddle. And here you see in this picture what the northern Arabian saddle looks like. He argues that because of the shape, the unusual shape of the dromedary, that is the one-humped camel, it was difficult to figure out a way to put a saddle on it that would provide a stable platform for fighting. But he argues that between 500 BC and 100 BC, that was developed. And so it's only after this that there is a stable platform for users of a long sword or spear and for mounted archers. And only at that time could camel nomadism begin as a lifestyle. So that is one of the questions that Bulliet deals with in this book, The Camel on the Wheel. I would argue it's a really neat book in a lot of ways, very thesis-oriented. But this isn't really the main question that the book deals with. The main issue that the book deals with is, why did the Middle East and North Africa abandon the use of the wheel on the beginning end, sometime between the 3rd and 6th centuries AD, and that is, they abandoned it during that period between the 3rd and 6th centuries, and they left it alone until about the 19th century. During that period, from say the 6th centuries until the 19th century, the wheel was pretty absent in the Middle East and North Africa, and travel and trade was done using the camel. So I thought I would say a few things about Bulliet's answer to the question of why the Middle East abandoned wheeled vehicles in favor of caravans of camels. And he emphasizes that the answer is primarily economic. There was economic reasons primarily that the wheel was abandoned. And this is going against the grain of some scholarship. There had been scholars for some times who argued that it was the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and along with it the decline of road maintenance, that brought about the turn toward the use of camels, and also the rise of the rule of Arab empires, and Arab rulers had a bias in favor of the camel. But Bulliet argues these two explanations have chronological problems. He argues that the changeover to the camel came earlier than the fall of Rome. And what we're dealing with here is the history of technology. And he argues that already by the 3rd century we see some abandonment of wheeled vehicles. And this is before the Roman Empire was really on the skids too much. He argues that in fact that the turn toward the use of camels came before Arabs were actually ruling some of this territory. He says the real reason was the economic advantages of the camel over the cart, the ox cart. He points out that Roman ox carts could travel only 6 to 9 miles per day, whereas camels could go 15 to 20 miles. He argues that a wagon and an ox required a driver, actually a driver for every 2 animals, whereas a single person could drive 3 to 6 camels. You could have an ox cart driven by several animals, but you would need a driver for every 2 animals. He argues that the cost of a wagon and oxen and a harness was a good deal greater than the cost of a camel, in fact, several camels. And of course, the camel could go without a road as well as with a road, so that made them more flexible. To be sure, there are other kinds of advantages of camels. Camels could go 17 days without water. They could drink 20 to 30 gallons in one sitting. They provided dung that you could use as fuel for cooking. And if you got in trouble out in the desert, you could slice open the stomach of a camel and drink the contents of the stomach and still survive. So the camel had a lot of different advantages, and there was a turn toward the use of the camel in that period from the 3rd to the 6th centuries. Let me turn to a different question in relation to the people who lived in the Arabian Peninsula. And that is social organization. What was it like? Many people talk about tribes amongst Arabs, and in fact, both nomads and town dwellers, whether they're merchants or farmers, did see themselves as being part of larger kin-based groupings, extended family groupings, which are translated into English as tribes. In theory, the tribe was the largest group to which a person would owe adherence. All of the members of a particular tribe were considered to be descendants of a remote common ancestor, though just between you and me, that remote common ancestor that was celebrated by a tribe was often mythical rather than real. But this was an entity from whom, that is, that person was an entity from whom members took their name. Some tribes were very loose. Some of them were tighter than others. One of the tightest was the Quraysh of the city of Mecca, Mecca in English spelling. And this is the spelling that the Goldschmidt textbook uses for the Quraysh, I believe. Tribes, though, tended to be looser than other smaller kinship-based groups. Some tribes never acted in common. Most of them lacked any meeting place for the entire group. And most Bedouins, most nomads of the 7th century, for example, probably identified more with the clan or lineage than with the tribe. A clan or lineage would claim closer common descent than a tribe would. One source says that a clan would often focus on the idea of common descent for 5 generations as the definition of a clan who belonged to a particular clan. In truth, however, it was not so formal a rule, and the difference between tribe and clan is not so clear-cut. Though by and large you can say that kinship is more traceable in a clan than in a tribe. A clan also might have a tighter nature. A clan might have a tighter nature than a tribe. A clan might share ownership of wells. They might camp together, the members of the clan. Sometimes they formed a tenning group. So as they moved, they would set up a camp, and their tents would be right next to each other's. But in fact, tenning groups didn't have to be kinship-based, and sometimes were not. But this emphasis on kin is a reaction to a lack of government. In the pre-Islamic age, throughout much of the Arabian Peninsula, there wasn't much in the nature of strong government. Government, to the extent that it existed at all, was weak, and I think you could say that for the most part it didn't exist in most areas. People speak of a kind of clan patriotism or tribal patriotism. The term here is asabiya, clan spirit or clan patriotism or tribe feeling, tribe patriotism. An emphasis was put on this since the extended family grouping was sort of the basis of society. And the extended family group, usually the clan, would provide protection for the members of the clan and for certain clients of the clan. Because in the absence of government, misbehavior of people was held in check by blood feud. Basically what that means is that if I harmed someone in your clan or killed them, your clan would see to it that someone in your clan would harm someone in my clan or kill them, depending on what I had done. The rule here is lex talionis, which translates as an eye for an eye, the law of vengeance of one's kin organization. There was no police, there was no law, and the thing that kept you from killing me was that you knew that my kin would come and kill you or someone in your clan as a price for what you did. To be sure, the ethics of clan life in this era were not all that negative. For example, people put a high value on hospitality, and one could gain a good deal of stature by being a host for others. Now, I talked about those 3 different groupings, the nomads and the farmers and the merchants. But there is interaction between the agricultural areas, the towns, and the desert, or the steppe, S-T-E-P-P-E, grasslands, these arid areas. As I mentioned before, nomads depended upon agricultural products that they had to get either through buying them from town-based merchants or raiding farmers or merchants. And raiding helped to confirm the unity of the clan. For a nomadic clan, it gave them military experience. It could also give them profit. One of the sources of profit was that nomadic tribes or clans would typically, as they carried on warfare, would take captives that they could hold for ransom rather than killing those captives. And again, it was a way of making a living. To be sure, there were some traditions which regulated warfare, regulated conflict. There were sacred truce months in which one should not carry on armed conflict. But as I mentioned before, nomads, the Bedouins, sometimes imposed tribute or taxes on settled peoples, sort of an equivalent of protection money. Let me say a little bit about trade. And the merchant class comes into this. The really big business was in luxury goods. And that was fragrances primarily. Frankincense and myrrh were produced in southwestern Arabia. There was an area down there referred to as Saba. By the 3rd century, a kingdom called Himyar grew up there also. The Romans referred to southwestern Arabia as Arabia Felix, Blessed Arabia, because it was an agricultural area, a rich agricultural area, and it was about the only place on earth where you could grow frankincense and myrrh that were so highly valued. Now, to be sure, across from Himyar on the Horn of Africa, you could grow, what is now Ethiopia, you could grow some frankincense and myrrh. And let me flip ahead to a map. And that's not the map, this is the map. Here you see Himyar, Saba, and down here you see Aksum, A-X-U-M. Aksum was a place where you could grow these goods also, these fragrances. But by and large, the state of Himyar had a good thing going with its almost exclusive access to frankincense and myrrh, and they traded them to the empires around them where these things were highly valued, like the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, where these were used in ceremonies, and Romans would pay a pretty penny for these goods. And there are a lot of accounts of the life of Muhammad and the period immediately before it, which speak of the town of Mecca, and let me go back to the map. Here is Mecca right here. I speak of it as a place that dominated long-distance trade in these luxury goods by the 500s. Muhammad is born, according to traditional timelines, around 570, and in the decades prior to this, according to traditional accounts, Mecca was already a really big trading city and was wealthy because of that trade. Here are some pictures. Here's a picture of the site of Sabah down in southwestern Arabia. That is the place that is now known as Yemen, Y-E-M-E-N. Here is one of the types of trees that produces frankincense. And to the left here you see the flowers of that shrub, and at the bottom you see the resin oozing out from the plant when the bark is scraped off. And that was what was highly valued, that resin. Here is a picture of myrrh, which was even more valuable than frankincense. But let me dwell for a moment on this idea that Mecca was a dominant city in high-value trade goods. There is a book by Patricia Crone, who died recently. The year I'm recording this is 2016. I just read her obituary last month. But she wrote a book entitled Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam. And in this book, she argues that Meccans were not so key in trade as people have thought. And if they had some degree of affluence at the time of Muhammad, their ascendancy had been very recent, but they were not so dominant anyway. And this is relevant because of an idea by that W. Montgomery Watt came up with to try to explain the rise of Islam. He argued that Muhammad's message was a protest against the way that wealth had turned people away from the values of clan solidarity and aid for the poor and hospitality for guests and so on. In other words, his message was a protest against the way in which society had become morally bankrupt, and particularly the wealthy had become morally bankrupt. Crone's argument would make Watt's thesis seem problematic. She argues that Mecca traded mainly in leather and cloth and even rags, and that was not a high-value mercantile activity. And therefore, affluence could not have so twisted people's values in the way that Watt posited. Might add that Patricia Crone's argument in this case, and this book was written in 1987, although Patricia Crone has come up with a lot of very striking theses and some of them have not been widely accepted by the scholarly community. This particular thesis of hers has been taken very seriously, and there are a lot of scholars who think she is correct about the idea of Mecca not being a center of particularly rich trade at the time of Muhammad or a little before. Well, let me turn to some other matters. Poetry is something that was highly valued, highly respected in pre-Islamic Arabia, and continued to be valued after that time. Scholars argue that there was a somewhat unified poetic language in Arabia on the eve of the rise of Islam, though there were variations in local speech. Poets were highly respected. They were celebrators of the group that they were part of, the tribe that they were part of, or the clan that they were part of. They sang the good qualities of the group, though I might add they also bragged about themselves in their poetry. So some of it is very self-centered in that way, but some of it focuses on the good qualities of the group that they are part of, the clan or tribe that they are part of. One of the things that they sang about was virtue, or muruwa. Virtue can be envisioned as a kind of manliness. It included bravery in battle, protection of the weak, hospitality given even to strangers, generosity to the poor, loyalty to the tribe, defiance toward the strong, and endurance. All of these were values that were subsumed under the category of virtue. Poets sometimes acted as a kind of social critic. Often this was criticism of other groupings, other clans. Like, our clan's better than their clan, and these are the silly, dumb things about their clan. Sometimes, though, they actually criticized some of the characteristics of the people that they knew in their own clan. People at the time saw poets as being possessed by a spirit. That was how they explained the stream of words that poets could come forth with. There are some traditional Muslim accounts of Muhammad's life which argue that some of his opponents saw him as a poet rather than a religious leader, though he emphatically denied it. At the same time, however, the Holy Book of Islam, the Quran, Quran, includes poetic language. Well, I've sort of moved in the direction of religion. So let me go there in a full-fledged way. Peoples in the Arabian Peninsula often practiced what is known as animism, and I guess I didn't put the word on the slide. Animism is A-N-I-M-I-S-M. A-N-I-M-I-S-M. Animism is a kind of religion which entails worship of spirits that are thought to reside in natural objects. And we are told that in the Arabian Peninsula, at the time that we're speaking of here, people believed the spirits resided in certain trees, in certain streams, in certain stones, and perhaps other things like little idols that were figurines of human beings or of animals or something like that. One scholar writing of religious belief during the period I'm talking about speaks of a cult of stones, that a lot of Arabs believed that particular stones were inhabited by spirits and worshipped them by circumambulating the stone, that is, walking around the stone in a circle. Sometime, perhaps a few decades before the time of Muhammad, peoples in the Arabian Peninsula had begun, some of them, to worship spirits in man-made idols, little figurines. Another type of entity worth knowing about is jinns. These jinns are a type of being that is referred to in some translations of the book The 1001 Nights, Nights. Sometimes it's also translated as the Arabian Nights. This is a collection of short stories from the Middle East. Often these translations into English translate jinn as genie, G-E-N-I-E. That's where we get the word genie. Sometimes jinn is translated as spritey. These are supposedly spiritual beings that have the power to appear and disappear suddenly and unpredictably. We are told that they sometimes took the shape of snakes or beasts, though sometimes they were invisible. They were said to haunt graveyards and wastelands. And by and large, they were seen in a negative light. They were believed to inflict death or madness on those who offended them. One other kind of deity worth mentioning is that some of the clans in Arabia had clan gods that they worshipped. These were gods of a particular political entity, a tribe or clan. Also, many people believed in kahins, which were soothsayers. They were people who supposedly could tell the future. They were regarded as being possessed by a jinn who put words into their mouths. And in fact, some of the early Muslim sources tell us that some of Muhammad's critics charged that he was nothing other than a kahin. So that was one way of divining the future. Another way of divination that some people embraced was trying to tell the future by viewing the flight of birds. Some of them also used arrows in various ways to try to tell the future or to predict the result of some action. One of the ways of doing this was to get a bunch of arrows, label 1/3 of them with the phrase God prohibits, 1/3 of them with the phrase God commands, and 1/3 of them would be left blank. And then these would be put into a quiver and shaken, and someone would draw an arrow, and the command on it, or the statement on it, would tell you whether God would support the kind of activity that you were contemplating. Also, people believed that they could protect themselves by carrying around amulets, which is a kind of charm or ornament worn against evil. One other thing worth noting is that Arabs at this point in time believed, at this period of time, believed that some areas were more sacred than other areas. And they carried out pilgrimages to some of those sacred points. One of those sacred areas was in Mecca, Mecca. And that sacred place was the Kaaba. I think I'm using the spelling here that Goldschmidt uses in his textbook. I try to, when I can, follow his spellings. Kaaba translates as the cube. It was the square building in Mecca which pre-existed Muhammad. There have been legends amongst some Muslim writers that the Kaaba was originally built by Adam of the Old Testament fame, that later Abraham and his son Ishmael rebuilt the Kaaba. And we're told later in the Quran that Muhammad purified the Kaaba. Let me back up. In some of the historical, the sources that purport to be historical sources, they speak of Muhammad purifying the Kaaba. The Quran does talk about Abraham and Ishmael's rebuilding of the Kaaba before Muhammad also was involved in a rebuilding operation when he was an adult. This was a point of pilgrimage. This building was a point of pilgrimage for some peoples across the Arabian Peninsula. There were various kinds of religious images in the Kaaba. The largest of the gods in the Kaaba at the time that Muhammad grew up was one named Hubal. Right here, Hubal. He was depicted as a very large statue of a human with a golden hand. And this was the largest god in the Kaaba. There were other gods associated with the Mecca area or nearby. There were the three so-called goddesses, Alat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, sometimes referred to as the three daughters of Allah, which translates as the God. I'll have more to say about it a little later. Alat is translated as the goddess. There was a cubic rock in the town of Taif, Taif, which is not too far from Mecca, that was a representation of this goddess. Excuse me. Al-Uzza was conceived of as Venus, the morning star. But there was a shrine east of Mecca, which had an idol in the form of a woman that was considered to be Al-Uzza also. Also, there was a goddess called Manat. And this was the goddess of fate. And it was represented by a female idol. I'm having trouble in my throat. I'm going to have to cut off this part of the lecture, cut it off right now, and set up a part B to take off from here.